If you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, Granger understands that you go to great lengths, and sometimes heights, to ensure the power is always flowing. Which is why you can count on Granger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRANGER, click Granger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
One of the main topics of discussion here at Beyond Atheism has been what impact the increase of a non-religious population will have on wider society. While the trend of diminishing religious affiliation is clear, it is not yet well understood how broad the effect of a non-religious plurality, or even majority, will be on society, or how much tension there will be between religious and non-religious groups. To talk more about the scope of change and the future of non-religious societies, we are joined by the Principal Investigator of the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project, Dr. Laurie Beaman. Dr. Beaman is the Canada Research Chair in Religious Diversity and Social Change and a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. Laurie, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Thanks, Laurie, for coming on. It's definitely good to get some Canadian content on the show. Just to begin, can you tell us about your own religious background and how you came to study non-religion?
Oh, sure. I mean, I can give you the long version or the short version. I'll try for something in between, and if something piques your interest, just say so. My religious pedigree is a bit mixed, actually. There was no one church. I have some contact with church when I was young. I have no one affiliation, and that's a result of my parents weren't churched, but my mother in particular felt it would be a really good idea for me to have some knowledge of religion. So she shipped me off to the United Church of Canada with our neighbors for a year or two. And if you know the United Church of Canada, it's a fairly liberal denomination. And I do credit the United Church of Canada partly with my ability to be able to see some of the positive influences of religion on society and the ways in which religions have participated positively in shaping society. But that wasn't a long-standing affiliation. I also frequently visited my cousins in another community about an hour away, and so went to their Sunday school, which also happened to be a United Church of Canada. And although it was a very rural community, they had an extremely diverse parade of ministers who came through that church. So I think that was a positive as well. And then when I was in my early teens, my mom herself decided to go to church. So she kind of I do consider it to be forced, us to go with her. And then when I was 14, I just said to her one Sunday, I said, I'm not going, and I don't care what you do to me. I'm not going any longer. And that was that. I mean, to give you a picture of what was happening, I went to a public school, and my grade 8 teacher was still homeroom teacher was still starting the day with the Lord's Prayer and a reading from her Bible on the desk in front of us. So that was public school. Yeah. But I also had friends who had religious commitments, and so I would occasionally, go to church with them or various church kinds of activities. I wasn't really good at it, this sort of like you're sitting around in the circle at one of these retreats and they say, pray for the person next to you. And I'd always forget to do things like that. So I wasn't really good at it and didn't really feel like I ever really belonged. But that's a kind of, quick description of my childhood. I'm from a family of 9 children. And so everybody, when I tell people that, or if they know that about me, they always assume that I grew up in a Catholic or a Mormon household, which I did not. But I just let it I just let that float. So how did I come to studying non-religion? That is really through religion, really through studying religion. I identify as a sociologist of religion. That's one of my academic identities. And I came to the study of religion through, believe it or not, my legal practice. I practiced as a lawyer for 5 years. And I worked in a small community, the small community where I grew up. And I saw a lot of very interesting things that, how can I say, really contradicted my assumptions about religious people. For example, I represented a woman who was Pentecostal and her husband was abusive, and her church came, her church family came and picked her up one morning, packed up her things for her, and moved her out of that relationship. And that was kind of contrary to what a lot of people would think about in terms of a conservative Christian, group or family, if you will. And then another client I had actually was part of the United Church, which, as I said, is a very liberal denomination. But she told me about the messages the pastor or minister in that church was speaking on Sunday mornings, which, wives submit to your husband, without really any qualifications at all. And so there were lots of things that challenged my assumptions and beliefs. And I started to go back to university, did my master's while I was practicing law, and I did my PhD, and became really interested in religion and violence against women and religion and the interface of those things. When I was directing the Religion and Diversity Project, which was the last large project that I directed before the Non-Religion, a Complex Future project, what became apparent when I was thinking about diversity and religious diversity was that this was missing a very large piece of the picture, which is what do we do with non-religious people when we think about religious diversity? And those questions started to become more and more apparent and important. And my co-investigators, some of them also thought those questions were important. And so when we finished that project, we developed a program of research and sought funding for the Non-Religion, a Complex Future project. So that is the story of my life and my research in a few minutes.
Really quick. It's really short when you put it that way. So that brings us up to the Non-Religion and a Complex Future project. One of the things that might be a stumbling point for us is the terminology, because it's about non-religion. I think we and many of our listeners often kind of default to this idea of that being atheism, right? We're thinking, okay, that means an atheist world or it means a secular world. But non-religion has a much broader meaning here, doesn't it?
It does. It definitely does. And I ask my team members, please don't just default to atheism, because there's a much broader spectrum of people and institutions and institutional practices we're interested in. And so we're thinking about people who are indifferent and who would never self-describe as atheist, but are just like, I don't know, I don't care. So we're interested in that group. We're interested in agnostics. And, I realize, people like Callum Brown have kind of expanded the atheist category to include all of those people, but I don't. And Callum and I have had a little friendly tussle on that. But we are, we're thinking about agnostic. We're even including spiritual but not religious people and asking, how they are thinking about some of the issues we're examining. And so, yes, it is a much broader understanding of non-religion. And, there is a whole rabbit hole we can go down with the terminology. And I recognize it's problematic. But for the moment, I also, I resist the word secular. I don't like using it because I see it used so frequently in a non-critical, unthoughtful, frankly, way. And it's a default that people rely on. It's a crutch. It's something that people rely on when they don't really explain it. They don't dissect it. And so I also avoid that. And in doing that, what I think is happening maybe is that I'm forced to be clearer about what I'm talking about. And I also think it forces nuance and complexity in a way that just defaulting to the secular does not. And, recognizing, of course, that there's some people doing some really important work on secularism, secularization, the secular. For example, people like Monica Woolrob-Sarr, who is insisting on multiple secularities, which is kind of what I'm getting at as well, but I just try not to use the word secular in this.
Well, secular is a word that we've been using a lot. So, like, when you examine this for the non-religion in a complex future, what is the nuance that you're finding? How do spiritual but not religious, or people who are just indifferent, how do they differ from what we would think of as secular or atheist or agnostic?
I don't know that they differ at all, but what I want to do is just suspend that terminology so as not to make assumptions. And please remember we are still in the middle of field work, and so I can't make any real definitive conclusions. But I'll just draw one example, and I'll tell you, maybe step back and tell you a little bit about the project. But first, I'll do the example, and that is the project. One of the projects on law. Is on law, and where we've begun, we had a number of things on our list, but the project we chose to begin with was looking at the ways in which social actors mobilize imaginaries, I suppose, I'm not quite sure what the word is to use, to be quite honest with you, but the ways in which they mobilize religion and non-religion in same-sex marriage debates. Now, we don't see the word secular a lot in those conversations, in law, in that context. We don't, so every once in a while, I'll see the Supreme Court, because I also do, kind of socio-legal analysis, and you'll see the word secular used by the Supreme Court, something like, we live in a secular society. But that's not that common. And so we're looking at the ways that people what is the language people are using? What is the language social actors are using in the legal context, in the legal field, around same-sex marriage debates? And of course, these debates happen at different times in different countries. And it's, for example, really fascinating to think about Canada in comparison with Australia, and the ways in which the time trajectory has shifted the language that is being used, and the mobilization of dignity by both groups who self-describe as religious and those who don't. And how does that shift? We were just talking the other day, because we meet quite regularly as a project team, and looking at the ways, for example, that language gets flipped. So, for example, a pro same-sex marriage group described evangelical Christians as anti-marriage, which is completely contrary to how we might think about it, and certainly the ways in which the evangelical Christians in those debates described themselves and what the work they were doing was. So those are the kinds of subtleties that I'm interested in, without reverting to same-sex marriage in a secular state. Well, what does that tell us? Let's drill down into that. So that's one example. But if you want, I'll just give you a quick snapshot of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, just so when we talk about some of these questions, you'll know who the players are, if you will, if you'd like me to.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're 3 years into this project. Obviously, the pandemic has shifted things a little bit. But actually, sometimes in positive ways. I don't know if you've been a part of a large project, but oftentimes what happens is, you're going to meet, and so everybody scrambles in the month before the meeting to get their work done. And the way the pandemic has changed our work pattern has been that we're actually meeting more frequently, and we're meeting by Zoom quite regularly, every couple of weeks. And that's been really great, because we also include all of the research assistants on the project, the postdocs. And so everybody meets, and we discuss ideas, and we talk about project design, project implementation, the field work, how that's going, etc. Of course, field work's been a little bit challenging, but we're managing. So overall, we're 9 co-investigators and 10 collaborators, 8 contributors, 20 institutional partners, including academic research centers, governments, civil society organizations, NGOs. We right now, I guess as of at the last count we did, which is in February, we have 41 students and 7 postdocs. And we have a great group of people, all are interested in non-religion. Some of them might describe themselves as being interested in secularism, but I ask them to try to avoid that word, and they comply most of the time, at least when they're in my presence. So, as you in your introduction, you talked about the impact of the increase in non-religion on society, and that's really the driving question, I suppose, of this project. We have 10 countries involved, so Canada, Australia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. So we called them the Nordic countries in our application, as though you could lump them all together, which you can't do, of course. The United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and Argentina. And so those are our countries, and they share an increasing number of people who self-identify as non-religious. But of course, in Brazil and Argentina, the numbers look a little bit different than they do in Canada. We are trying to develop new research tools and methods as our projects present. We're again looking or hoping to look at, and in the process of looking at, the social impact of non-religion, trying to expand the conceptualization and theorizing of diversity to include non-religion, because of course diversity is a government buzzword these days. Looking at conflicts, collaboration between religious, non-religious people, however we might describe it, or social actors, and then thinking about what does it mean, where does religion, non-religion come into that.
Have there been big projects I mean, the scope of this sounds massive, and I'm wondering if it's been attempted before. Is there anything sort of on this scale or anything that's been like this? And I know secular studies are, sorry to lump you in that with that group, but studying non-religion, it's a fairly new field. It's been understudied for a long time, but were there other projects that this is building off of, or is it starting at square one?
Oh no, we're not starting at square one. I mean, that's the exciting thing about being in this field of research. We're in conversation with other people and groups, and of course the Understanding Unbelief Project, Lois Lee, John Landman, among others, that's been a really exciting place for us to turn. Their project was more focused on individual beliefs and attitudes, and our project is not so focused on individual beliefs and attitudes, more looking at practice, although not exclusively. So there's some lovely overlap with them, and certainly it's been a pleasure to be in conversation with them. And the new project that John Landman is leading, whose name I forget, I apologize for not remembering the name of his project, but that and Johannes Quack has been doing some research, particularly around indifference. So there are individual researchers, obviously, and then a couple of other large projects. There's an emerging project in Turkey. I'm an advisor for that project, and also in relatively close contact with them as they want to develop their project using some of our project models. And we're, of course, learning from them too. And that's exciting, because then we're dealing with a society that's been predominantly more majoritarian Muslim as opposed to majoritarian Christian. And we're looking at some of the differences, and the conversations are really just beginning, but we're looking at some of the differences, but also some of the similarities. So that's quite an exciting overlap and conversation for us to be involved in as well. So yes, there are other projects. I believe there's another one based in Britain, and I don't know those researchers, but I need to get to know them, because I think that, and I've already mentioned Monica Wolrab-Sar, who's done for a long time the Multiple Secularities Project and made huge contributions to the field of secular studies. So there are lots of conversation partners, but we're trying to make sure that what we carve out is a little bit different so that we can bring something new to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're going to ask about each of the sort of the planks of the project. But before we do that, I want to, just because it's nice to have a Canadian on, maybe I can ask you specifically I know the project is focused internationally or on multiple countries, but maybe you can just talk a bit about the Canadian context. It's like many of our listeners, I think, are outside of Canada. And so could you tell us about what is kind of Or what should people know about the Canadian context of non-religion?
Yeah, that's a good question, and important, I think, to consider the context of any country as we consider non-religion, unbelief, indifference, however we want to move through the parade of terminology. And maybe this is my legal training lets me want to always start with the Constitution, but we
Right,
don't
right.
Mhm.
we don't have an official separation of church and state, and so that's really nor do we have a state church, and so I think those kinds of things make a difference, but not necessarily they're not necessarily determinative. That so it's important to know that, but there are many other important questions to ask about that. Our charter, for example, recognizes the rule of law and mentions God in the preamble, and which was highly controversial and still remains so on occasion when people try to mobilize it, especially in the law, in legal matters. We have about 24%. This is old StatsCan data. The new data are not. It hasn't been released yet. Is what I'm trying to say. And so about 24% of Canadians say they have no religion. And, what exactly that means is still unclear, which is kind of exciting if you're a researcher interested in this, because it means there are things to research. So Brian Clark and Stuart MacDonald have written a really interesting book called Leaving Christianity. And I really like their book. It's very carefully researched, and they look at all kinds of measures of religion. And they conclude that if you consider those who might be affiliated but basically non-participating and so on, that Canada is actually up around 55% of people who have no meaningful connection with any kind of organized religion. But of course, yeah, then what do we do? We need to think about what to look at behind that, I suppose. But it is important to think about that. We look a bit like Australia in terms of our profile, not quite as high in terms of non-identification as the UK. And in terms of the Nordic countries, I think we're comparable, although it's interesting to me that everybody always describes the Nordic countries as secular, especially Sweden. And yeah, again, when you drill down, what exactly does that mean? And that's when you start to see the ways in which countries who have had established religions, the ways in which one does not have to have an established religion in order for organized religion, especially Christianity in the context I'm talking about, to have shaped society, social institutions, social expectations. It is part of the social fabric. And that's another reason that I resist just defaulting to the word secular, because I think we need to go deeper than that. So I'm not sure if that's told us enough about Canada. Certainly, a non-significant part of the population identifies as non-religious. In their book, Clark and MacDonald raise questions about what does that mean in terms of charitable giving, in terms of volunteering, and so on. And I think those are legitimate questions, but I think that we can answer them and think more carefully about what the impact is, both positive and perhaps potentially negative.
Well, yeah, I guess we should get to some of the aspects that you're looking at. And you see this move to religion has having a it's, it's pretty far ranging. Nathan and I just spent some time talking about death from the atheist perspective. It's a little uncomfortable and scary. But your project is investigating how decreasing religion impacts death and dying. Is this culturally or is this policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to consider this. So let's start with palliative care. And you think about a country that has predominantly identified as Christian for a long, long time. And you don't maybe think about this, but the ways in which people are offered palliative care are structured around a set of assumed shared beliefs about things like an afterlife. And so if you're trying to comfort someone, for example, oh, well, you'll be in a better place. Well, what if you don't believe there's a better place? What if you believe you're in that place now? And so there's been a struggle, and I've talked with palliative care workers. We haven't launched this project yet. We're still trying to build it, but palliative care workers have indicated to me that they need to know more about people who identify as non-religious and what their needs during the dying process might be. We've just been gathering data on obituaries, and so we're again in the midst of this. So we've been looking at obituaries from 1900 to present, and thinking about, and death notices, and thinking about how do people self-present? What's presented as important? Is that shifting? Has that shifted? And we move from death notices and essentially very little mention of people, their biographies, and so on in the early period of when we're looking at, pardon me, and we move to the lengthy expose of people's lives. We might think, for example, too, about the mention of church, or a lifelong member of, and how that appears or disappears depending on the time. We're also trying to correlate this with specific moments in history. So World War II, for example, the AIDS epidemic, and thinking about how did that impact, what were the codes used for people who died of AIDS when their families did not want to be explicit about that, and how has that shifted, for example, around the way we describe cause of death, or do we? Donations. Oftentimes you'll see, please, no flowers, please donate to. And then has it shifted from, the local parish fund to the SPCA? We don't know the answers to that yet, but I think this tells us some things. We're also interested in cemeteries and funeral practices. There's been some work done on funeral practices, and we're interested in cemeteries, forest burials, the turn to quote unquote nature. So all of those kinds of things are the ways in which people are talking about death and commemorating death, celebrations of life, the shift in language to celebration of life rather than funeral. All of those are questions and things that we're interested in. The death cafes, and the role that they're playing in providing a space for people to talk about death in a space where people are asked not to proselytize.
What exactly are the death cafes? Could you tell us more about what they are?
Cafes,
I've never heard that term before.
they exist all around the world. I hadn't realized this until a couple of years ago, and I had heard about one, and then I just said, when we do this project, I think we should think about death cafes as a really interesting place to explore non-religion and death and dying. And in fact, they used to be held in person in various communities. People would just gather a group of people together in a cafe. The idea was to have a safe space to talk about death. They have a set of rules. No proselytizing, for example, is one of the rules. And people come together to talk about death and dying. It's not so much a bereavement grief group as simply talking about what it means to die, how we understand it as human beings. And yeah, so we're interested in death cafes as a site on which we might explore religious and non-religious understandings of death and dying, or the ways in which social actors position themselves in terms of religion or non-religion in that context. So we're hoping to do a series of focus groups with people that will talk about their experiences in death cafes, and and then try to relate that to how we understand the process of death and dying, and whether we can identify anything that's changing in terms of how people are understanding it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I guess there's sort of five main areas of the project. So one is the health and the death and dying. Another one is about nature and the environment. Do non-religious people sort of relate to the environment and nature in different ways than religious people?
I think there's a bit of literature that talks about that. It's a bit It's a bit thin, that literature. And I'm not sure that ultimately that's the direction we're taking on this project. I'm interested in, is the increase in non-religion increasing space for a different kind of relationship between non-human animals and human beings? In other words, as stewardship, for example. So we use that word stewardship. Religious, non-religious social actors use the word stewardship. I had a debate with a friend one day. He works for a salmon conservation group, and he talked about stewardship. And I said, well, why do you use that word? Because it is implicitly hierarchical. And he had never thought about it. He had never thought about the use of the language of stewardship. But that's a language that very much is positioned or originates in Christianity. And I mean, Lynn White, back in the 1960s, was challenging the language of stewardship and the Christian approach to nature. And he himself identified as a Christian. But I'm interested in, okay, what happens now? What happens when we see a shift in power dynamics? We see Christianity becoming one religion and one worldview among many, rather than necessarily the dominant. That hasn't quite happened yet, but it's on its way. And then are we then able to have space for a different way of thinking about human, non-human animal relations and human nature relations? And frankly, I think we really need to focus on this given the climate crisis. I think this is the way forward. And I recognize that there are Christian groups who are engaged in environmental activism and thinking about Christianity and the environment. But I also think that there's a space that may have been opened by this shift. And that is what interests me. We have two projects that are directed at thinking about some of these issues: human, non-human animal relations, human nature relations, human conceptualizations of nature and the world around them. One of them is our trekking project, and we're looking at hiking, walking, and trekking. I think we've called it Trekking Toward Awe. And we've conducted a survey in all of our countries, and we are just winding that down. And one of the things that's fascinating us is that though we don't have a random sample, but there are some commonalities across countries that lead us to believe that there's something, there is certainly validity in this survey that we've conducted. And one of the, I'll just give you one snapshot of one thing we did in that. We asked people to write a letter to nature. And the letters to nature, we've just done, Ryan Cragen is on this project with us. And Ryan, as you may know, is a quantitative and guru and anything he probably hated that I used that word. And so anything he can measure, he will. But one of the things he proposed doing was a word cloud with the letters to nature. And we look at, sorry being a word that is a predominant word. We see a lot of guilt and angst across countries, and people, the ways in which people are trying to talk to nature, reimagining the human relationship to the world around us is, to me, the most exciting part of this. To think about is there a discourse of equality, for example, that's emerging? Because I'm interested in equality and the ways in which in which hierarchies are flattening, in which the world is becoming more horizontal. And so that's what's interesting me about these projects. And the community gardening project is asking questions about world repairing work and the ways in which different kinds of people work together. And so there we see the religious, non-religious social actor interface, and looking at, we also have some analysis that's thinking about race and ethnicity, and looking at the ways that people transcend difference and try to co-garden together, for example, and share practices of sharing and so on. So this is the world repairing dimension, one of the world repairing dimensions of the project. Thinking about how do people who are different get along? Because ultimately that is another of the big questions involved in this project, which is, how do we live together? How do people who self-describe as atheist, agnostic, humanist, indifferent to religion, how do we live together with people who have deep religious commitments and commitments that impact their day-to-day lives and practices? How do we sort that out? And so I'm in both of these projects, and in most of the project in general and the program of research, I'm interested in coming at some of these questions a sort of sideways way. A few years ago, I did a project, and I'm still kind of doing it, on sea turtle rescue. Everybody kind of laughs when I say that. I'm a sociologist of religion and a legal scholar,
Right.
and I'm doing a project on sea turtles.
Yes.
Like, why? What are you doing? But I did it because I was interested in knowing a little bit about religion, non-religion, but not asking people up front about it. I think you get particular answers when you ask particular questions about religion, non-religion. But if you ask people about what matters to them, you start to really get a sense of how their daily lives look and how they do things like transcend difference, how they do see the world around them, the practices that are important to them, the things they commit time and energy to. I think that tells us a lot more than necessarily staying belief fixated.
Yeah. I'm glad you put it that way, because it sounds like a lot of what this project is sort of identifying that, what you described as the imaginary earlier, the sort of like underlying assumptions that we share about everyone, like not just our collective knowledge, our collective idea of what the normal person believes, and that it's going to be different when we have a majority, a religious majority society has a different baseline sort of understanding than a irreligious majority society, and that we communicate that and act on it differently. That sounds like what you're describing here. Is that at all correct, or am I off base here?
No, I think you're on base. And I mean, I can think about, for example, assisted dying, to go back to our health area. And when we think about assisted dying and the ways in which, for example, in early court decisions in Canada, at least, when the courts talked about assisted dying, they actually, glorified suffering. And, suffering is okay, and you can't take your own. And the language was very, very Christian. And I mean, in fairness to probably also very Jewish and probably also very Muslim. So don't want to just finger Christianity in that. But
Right.
we live in
Yeah.
a majoritarian Christian society, and very much the sort of glorification of suffering was part of that conversation. Then when you fast forward to the decision that legalized medically assisted dying in Canada, you see a really different conceptualization of what it means to talk about death and dying. And the court talks about the sanctity of life, which is often rhetoric mobilized by the religious right. But the court appropriates that language and says, one's life includes one's death, and one has the right to determine. And so we see a major shift. And I do think that shift is because of the loosening of ties by religion, specifically Christianity in Canada as the majoritarian religion. And, some people lament that and some people celebrate it. But I think we need to pay attention to that kind of language. The project we're doing on migration, again, to go back to your observation, we're thinking about what does it mean to offer settlement services to immigrants, and how are they imagined? And I started to think about this in relation to the Syrian refugee crisis. And what started to intrigue me and interest me as a scholar was that much of the language around receiving was around the imagined observant Muslim refugee. And so, for example, you had towns, and I've written a piece with Jennifer Selby and Emily Barra on this because it really interested me how, for example, small towns would be excluded from possible receiving communities, the list of receiving communities, because they didn't have a mosque. And the assumption was
Right.
that if,
Yes.
yes, exactly. So we're expanding that, that brief foray with very little data into that world. We're expanding that in this project, and we're in the process of designing a project where we will talk to receiving agencies about their practices, about their imaginaries. We have anecdotal evidence, and that's a frustrating thing when you have only anecdotal evidence, but not really a wholesale, good, reliable empirical data to suggest that a lot of people who come as refugees or as immigrants don't necessarily want those, religious services,
Yes.
if you will.
Yeah.
And yet, in
Yeah.
order to, if you think about it, you come to a country, your first language may not be English or French in the case of Canada. You're struggling to settle in. You're struggling to find a place for yourself. You may not have all kinds of resources. And you're directed to a religious organization
Right. Yes.
as
Yes.
your
Yeah.
method of settling. That's not to say religious organizations aren't doing good work, but I think the question remains, how are migrants, how are immigrants, refugees imagined in terms of religiosity, religious, non-religious? To put it bluntly, if you have brown skin, are you necessarily religious? And I think currently there's a tendency to racialize assumptions around religiosity. And I think we need to challenge that. I think we need to explore it and examine it first, and then think about, okay, what does it mean when our public policy, when our policy around migration and settlement is geared toward a particular configuration of society and a particular imaginary that isn't actually correct.
hmm Yeah. I think that's a really important point. I mean, yeah, there's so much more we need to get to, but I just wanted to ask a quick sort of follow up, I guess, for this and more generally in the project. Is there kind of like a normative dimension to the project in that, like, are you hoping to kind of encourage people to think a particular way about things, or is it more just sort of a descriptive sort of thing, or how do you sort of see that?
I think by asking the question, how do we live well together, we necessarily become a normative. And frankly, I think there's always a normative dimension in any piece of research. And it doesn't matter whether it's sociological, anthropological, or, biological. There's always a normative dimension. The question we ask, the question we choose to focus on is always informed by normative dimensions. So there's always a subjective element to any piece of research. I think what I would like to do with this project is to simply expand our knowledge about what it means to self-describe as non-religious, not necessarily mire this conversation in identities. I think identities are an important piece, but also to look at social practices, social institutions, and the ways in which those are organized around assumptions about who people are, and particularly in their religious or non-religious lives, or somewhere in between. I think I'd also like to ensure that there's a complexity. One of the things that I've observed in doing this kind of research is what I've called a will to religion and a will to non-religion. And so all the people who want to, we know that scholarship on religion, particularly in the United States, but not solely, is very pro-religion. But I see a flip side to this, and that is that people who are studying atheism always want to find atheism. See, they don't go to church, so they're really atheists.
Yes.
And the religious people are, see, they admit that they call themselves spiritual.
Right.
They're religious. They're really religious. And I'm trying very hard to move down that fine line in between those two very strong wills to religion and non-religion, because I think as scholars, we need to do that. We need to think about what is it we're seeing rather than are we finding what we wish existed. So that
Yes,
might not
right.
be the most popular thing to say, but sometimes I succeed in that, and sometimes I don't succeed in that. But I do keep in mind that to keep in mind what people themselves describe as important, and to not ossify that, to not assume that when people say this is important to me right now, that's forever, and you close the book. It's not forever. People's lives change, social institutions change, social practices change, policy language changes. And so we're always looking at a moving target. And if we can stay nimble and open to interpretive possibilities, then I think we're better scholars for it.
Hmm. Yeah, so we got to try and make sure we cover all 5 of these, the planks of the project. And so the fourth one is about law. And,
We
well,
can combine them, law and
law
education.
and okay, that's a good idea. Okay.
Yeah,
No, don't do
to
that.
keep it going, because that's, I mean, that
Oh, no, okay.
no.
Just
Well,
like,
we'll just ask
see,
once and
our
let you
time
talk.
is running
Yeah.
short. Yeah.
Well, tell
I
me to
don't
give
know
shorter
what a way
answers then.
to, oh,
It,
that's, well, yeah.
but it was such a good wrap up that
Yeah.
you just gave.
No, no, I mean, it's so interesting though. I guess I don't know what a way to ask a question to combine both of these topics, but basically, well, I can just say, how does non-religion fit into law and education in your project?
There you go. Well, so, in fact, I've already talked a little bit about one of the law projects we're doing and thinking about same-sex marriage and the process of legalization of some variation of same-sex marriage. In most of the countries participating in this, same-sex marriage is legal, and so we're doing a project on that. But I mean, I think another dimension of this is to look at, and this is one of my kind of tangents. You said I could go on tangents, so I mean, here I go. Well, I'm very interested in the displacement of language around religion to the language of culture, and what I mean by that is thinking about the ways in which symbols and practices that were formerly thought of or imagined to be specifically religious, like crosses, crucifixes hanging in hospitals, prayers before council meetings or parliamentary sessions, and so on. The ways in which people have started to describe these as cultural and really, therefore, unassailable. And so that's part of what interests me in this, is that shift to displacing particular practices and symbols as culture. Normally, these symbols and practices are part of majoritarian religious culture or part of majoritarian religious society, then this is a kind of defense mechanism. And it's a way to lift those practices out of something that can be examined usually under law in some ways. So I think it's important to think about that. And it's a pattern that's, I'm just working on a piece with Teemu Terra in Finland. Julia Martinez Areño has worked on this in Spain. There are a number of other scholars. Damon Merrill and Avi Aster have looked at this also in the United States and around the world, and looked at the whole process of culturalization. So these are, this to me is an interesting phenomenon. We're also, we have other areas, and I can segue into the education area by saying that we're also hoping to think about education and the law and some of the legal practices around religion and non-religion. In the education area, we're also thinking about, the big question: should we teach about religion? There's a big push. Religious literacy is the language of diplomats, is the language of policymakers. And I think we need to ask hard questions about that. But the team who is working on the education piece of this, they are asking questions about images of citizenship. What does it mean to talk about a good citizen? The good citizen has typically been imagined to be churched in some way, and then that expanded to have a religious affiliation. So beyond church, to mosque, synagogue, and so on. But what does it mean to talk about a good citizen? Rather than simply asking questions point blank about religion, non-religion, asking questions about citizenship is another one of those oblique entry points that helps us to better, I think, see social processes. And I think it's a more subtle and more complex way to come at the question around religion and non-religion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting the way you're doing it, where you're sort of approaching it, not at a sort of direct angle, but kind of maybe from the side or something like that. It's sort of an interesting way to approach it. We're gonna move on to our lightning round. Yeah, so in this, well, we usually ask, can a true atheist do such and such? Can a true atheist say, "Oh my God," or something like that? But Lori, for you, we're gonna change it to, can a true non-religious person.
Yeah.
Uh, so we've got a few questions to ask, and just give us sort of a short answer. You just give a short couple of sentences justifying your answer. So the first question: can a true non-religious person believe in God?
Oh, well,
Mm.
this is tricky. Some, I mean, if you look at affiliation, if you want to say, well, you can be non-affiliated. If that means non-religious, a lot of non-affiliated people believe in God. But then the one that always puzzles some of us is when you have people who self-identify as atheists and then say they
Yes.
also believe in God.
Right.
That remains a mystery. I've had conversations with Ryan Cragen about this, and that does remain a bit of a mystery. And I just really want to talk to those people and ask them how they make sense of that for themselves. And I think it's important to do that. Ask people how they make sense of these things. Ask them, why don't they see a contradiction? Let's explore those questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember seeing in a Pew poll or something, it is something like, 1 to 2% of atheists say they believe in a God, and you wonder if it's they didn't understand the question, or they marked the wrong answer, or they're confused or something. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, let's ask people. I think that's a valuable thing to do. Ask people how do they make sense of that? I mean, isn't that it? I think that's the best part of doing research, are these contradictory bits where you have to make sense of things that make no sense.
Yeah. How big? But that can't be a big population.
No, I don't think so. I can't remember. It's just tiny portion.
Yeah, it's not zero anyway. Yeah.
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 Okay. Can a true non-religious person attend a religious service regularly?
Yes. I think they can. And particularly if they're a researcher.
Okay. Okay.
No. I'm gonna now. I'm also gonna answer you with an example from one of my research projects, and that's from the Turtle Project, and a woman who identified as non-religious. I can't remember if she explicitly called herself an atheist, but she definitely said she was non-religious. And she said she goes to church with her mom every week. She said she does it for her mom. So people do lots of things for lots of reasons. So yes.
Can a true non-religious person identify as a Christian or a Muslim, etc.?
Oh, they do regularly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
that's another one. How do you disentangle that?
Yeah, but think about it. I mean, some places you can't identify as non-religious. If you live in a place where identity cards give you like 3 options and they're all religious, what do you do? And then we get into real identity. You mean really identify as, and we can do that too. But people mobilize identities for all kinds of reasons. And so, yes.
Okay. Can a true non-religious person use religious iconography like the prayer emoji? Or the cross as a cultural symbol, if that's easier.
No.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, again, people do. And so I would want to ask them what that means to them. The problem with symbols becomes that they have also sometimes a life of their own. I mean, I recognize that we don't commonly talk about that. We think, oh, well, the meaning of symbols is socially constructed, and that is true. But if you're an Indigenous person in Canada and you go into a house and your mom or dad was in a residential school and you go into a hospital and you see a crucifix hanging there, the meaning of that crucifix may be a bit different for you than it is for someone else who identifies in a different way. So yeah, I think it's important to ask questions around that. And what is the purpose for which the symbol is being used? What is the person trying to convey? And then I'm always interested in power. Is there a power play going on here, with the use of a symbol? So I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly.
Can a true non-religious person believe in an afterlife?
Well, if we think about people who are maybe spiritual but non-religious, they may well think about an afterlife. I mean, a lot of people. So I went to this exhibition, actually, the Religion Diversity Project did some collaboration with what was called then the Museum of Civilization, and they had an exhibition called Gods, and they had this really neat thing where they asked people what happens when you die, and you put like an answer in a box, and then I had access to some of those answers, and those answers revealed that afterlife afterlife is defined by people in many different ways. And so afterlife can mean simply energy and decomposing matter and, the energy of decomposing matter. And that can be afterlife. So again, it's like sanctity of life. Depends on how you define it. How's that for a good gray answer?
Okay, well, here we'll try to make them trickier then. Can a true non-religious person assume others are also non-religious?
I don't think you should ever assume anything about anyone. So yeah, yeah. I'm just gonna.
I would attempt to reword this.
You want to? Okay, you want to reword it? Okay, reword it, and then
because I'm thinking about it in the sense of the sort of imaginary, right? If we have this society, it's culturally religious or culturally one religion is dominant. There's sort of that baked in assumption, right? That this is what people are, and I'm wondering if in non-religious majority societies or communities that's sort of how people will do it more than the normative assumption. Does that make sense?
Oh, not really, but I would, but I would say, I would still say, assume nothing. Assume nothing. I mean, why make those assumptions? Although I do remember driving with a colleague once when I lived in Alberta. I was driving with a colleague. He was driving me to Calgary for the weekend. He happened to be going because his parents lived there. And I looked up and there's this big anti-abortion billboard. And I'm like, oh my God. Because we don't have those in where I live right now. Yeah. And I was just on, and he just looked at me and said, we probably shouldn't talk about this. Oh no. And that was that. So assume nothing. Tread carefully. Tread carefully and tread with respect, actually. Tread with respect. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Can a true non-religious person tell kids that an Easter bunny has hidden eggs for them?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sort of a topical question, I guess. Can a true non-religious person do yoga?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, right. Okay. I'm supposed to justify.
Justify. Yes. Yeah.
Again, if yoga, if yoga just means yeah, I mean, you can, a true non-religious person can do yoga. Yes. Why do I think that? Because I think the meaning of yoga is different for many different people. People interpret it differently and so on. I've actually worked on yoga a little bit from a scholarly perspective with my friend and colleague Sonia Sika, and we've kind of marveled at the way in which Westerners go to India to get the real yoga experience, and the ways in which yoga is produced in India to satisfy the Western audience. There's a whole wardrobe that no self-respecting Indian would be caught dead wearing that's
Mm,
produced for, the yoga tourist. So that
right.
all of
Yeah.
that to say, sure, participate, and how you interpret it is, there's such a wide range of interpretations.
We've got one last one. Can a true non religious person want a world without religion?
Um, I think we'd be impoverished. I think difference is good, and I think figuring out how to work through difference is good. I think religious traditions contribute a different way of being, a different way of understanding, and so to wish for a completely non-religious world, no, I think diversity, difference, and sorting that out and learning to live well together is really important.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good optimistic note sort of to end on. Yeah, Lori, do you want to just tell us how can people find out about the non-religion in a complex future project?
We have a website, and now you want now you want me to remember the address, which I
Oh
never
yeah,
do.
well we'll throw everything
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
notes down below. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. We have a website, and that's the best way. And we do periodic, public events actually quite frequently, and people are most welcome to come.
Thanks again, Lori. This is really fantastic. Okay, that was Dr. Lori Beaman from the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. So, Todd, what did you take away from that conversation?
Well, one, she's damn good. It's incredible. The people we get for this show always blow my mind. And even before all the data's in, there's still stuff in there that I think it felt game changing, right? I mean, the point that maybe what we're looking at isn't the move to a secular world, but to a non-religious one, and that's different from secular. That's
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
That's
what would you say the difference is?
Well, it's not what I would say. I think it's what she would say. Is that most people are not religious, right? So when we're coming at the coming world, when we think beyond atheism, right? What is the world as we imagine it? What's the world that we want to make it? What's the world the way we want it to be? We're thinking about it from an atheist perspective or an anti-theist perspective, an anti-religious perspective, where we see like the encroachment of religious power as a bad thing and you need to diminish that power. That doesn't sound to be what non-religious people think, right? Non-religious people think I'm not religious. I don't care one way or the other. And like through this study, that's what it's going to reveal, like what they like how non-religious people see themselves, what they want. And for us, Dr. Beaman made this point a few times that like that future is going to be negotiated. And it's not just religious and anti-religious forces. It's not just theists and secularists. It's going to be a lot of people who are indifferent. And I mean, the numbers that she presented, the way she described Canada as like, it could be even now majority non-religious. That's astounding,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's
Yeah.
that's powerful.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the framing it as non-religious versus like more narrowly focused on atheists. I mean, obviously, like atheists fit into that into that larger category of non-religious, but there's a whole bunch of other people in there, like indifferent or these sort of spiritual but not religious
Yeah,
people
the
who
weirdest
have
category. Yeah.
kind of like a mishmash of different beliefs. Like maybe they even on their face like say they're Christian or something, but really they're not actually in practice or something. So I think it's interesting. I mean, yeah, and I think one interesting thing about the project is that other kind of similar projects, I guess, focus on, like how many non-religious people are there and like what do they think and so on. And I mean, obviously there's a ton of value in doing that. But I think what's interesting about this is it's like, how is a society actually going to change when this demographic shift happens or like as it's happening now? And like what sort of areas of life are going to be impacted and how? I mean, I think it's really, yeah, quite an interesting approach. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that, like, they got into discourse analysis, like, analyzing not what was said necessarily, but how it was said, right? And she talked about it in, I think, the debates over, end of life and gay marriage, where it's not just the policy, it's not just the law, it's about how it's written. And that we find in that language this shift to non-religious language, non-religious ideas, or it co-ops religious language and uses it in a way that's not the religious understanding, which is absolutely fantastic, right? I mean, that shows that there's a cultural undercurrent that is shifting away from this religious perspective. That maybe that the culture, at least at maybe at elite levels, maybe at technical levels, has already shifted away. And it is reinforcing this non-religious view in a way that we didn't know to look there. And like to uncover that and to reveal it is, I think, like, if they find more of that, it to me that's an astounding revelation that it's been hiding in plain sight. That the way we discuss these things shows that our culture has moved on and is tending already towards a non-religious dominance.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I found interesting was on the section of migration, and she was talking about, I mean, it's interesting too, like the way religious assumptions are still sort of built into certain things. Like she was talking about, refugees who are coming from Muslim
Yeah, yeah.
majority countries, and then sort of the assumption that once they come to, well, to wherever, to Canada or wherever, they must be looking for like a local mosque to
Right, yeah.
meet up with or
Right.
whatever.
That's what they need. So yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and I mean that's not. I mean, it could be true, but it's not. It's
It's
not
a
for
weird
sure.
assumption,
It's
right?
just an
But
assumption. Yeah, and
yeah.
it's interesting, like the way that could sort of be, like racialized or whatever. That like I don't know, like like Ukrainian refugees or something. Like, is the first port of call for them supposed to be a church or something because they
Right,
come
is
from
it
like a
yeah, it doesn't
Christian?
need to be Eastern Orthodox, right? Like,
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like
why should
yeah,
we expect that?
yeah,
Yeah.
like we need to settle these people in a place with Eastern Orthodox church or something. So, I
Right,
mean,
yeah.
yeah,
But
but
now, I mean,
yeah,
here's
yeah,
the crazy thing about this is that if we put up if we have that same perspective, that same insight, and hold up a mirror to our own cultures, the thing that we see is that these sort of assumptions that, and it's not just an assumption that or a stereotype. It's sort of like a schema or a formula, or that's sort of like the way we interpret information, right? Is that we kind of need to know how to relate to other people. And wherever you meet somebody, when you talk to them, you need sort of a formula to understand their information, whether it's the signals that they give you, it's body language, it's the direct language, it's subtext, whatever it is. Like, we need a way of understanding that. And kind of, I don't know if this happens to you, but like when you meet people, you kind of have to feel out, like, how religious are they, right?
yeah, yeah. That's
Right.
a good point.
Am I dealing with a very religious person? Is this someone who'd be offended if I came out as an atheist? Is this someone where it would dead end our conversation if they knew I was an atheist? But
Yeah,
like
yeah,
now, if we take the information that we know about atheism in the US and Canada, we take the information of like the statistics that we know about non-religion in the West and in the US and Canada. One of the things that changes is that that underlying assumption now can probably shift. And you can say that, like, if you meet someone under 30, under 25,
Yeah, right.
they're
Yes.
probably not a Christian,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that is a tremendous shift to go from this idea of like, oh, what if I'm dealing with an evangelical to this person is most likely not religious. That is
Yeah.
a huge shift in how we relate to one another. I mean, later on in, 15, 20 years, it becomes the identity of the entire country. But that's a very interesting dynamic that's potentially going to be uncovered and realized further. Like, and what does it mean? How does it change how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we interact?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, like, because I mean, sometimes like when I was like doing my PhD or something, and like I would be getting my hair cut or something, and like
Oh
the
yeah.
person is sort of like asking me like what I study, and I'm like, I don't know, like should I say? I mean, because like
Yeah.
you're really at the
Oh
mercy of the
yeah.
person
Yep.
cutting your hair, and if they
Yeah.
like, and then if they think you're an atheist or something, then they might give you a bad haircut.
Totally.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it's definitely true. I mean, like you say, like if it's a young person, and like I think there's a whole bunch of other things like their clothing or something could sort of be a clue or something about that or whatever. All sorts of things. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's funny though. Like there was that one thing she was talking about just at the end in the kind of true non-religious person segment, talking about like the time she saw this like anti-abortion billboard, and like she was saying to the person like, oh, this is so horrible. And the guy's like, yeah, like, you shouldn't talk about this. Like,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
it is so, I mean, sometimes it's like, you obviously you can guess
It
wrong, I
matters.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
then there are lots of clues that that kind of, not quite secret handshakes, but ways that you can communicate your belief or non-belief with other people, and we can work that stuff out. Also, on the flip side of that, where I am, there are a few like super religious billboards, and they don't make any sense. I can't even describe them. But yeah, like read the room, people. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a different dynamic. And as a follow-up to that, it kind of makes me one of the things I think about, and this is me stretching, this is me kind of blue skying, getting a little weird with the ideas, but that brush that atheists often get tarred with, that like nihilism, right? Well, you believe in nothing and you want nothing, and your idea is just destroy something, and then we have no morality and we have no beliefs, and that's what you follow. Actually, if we follow this through, one of the things it points to, and it's not definitely there, but the idea, what we could be seeing is something where there's this idea of religious belief and this religious worldview, and there might be a segment of the population that has this worldview of nothing, right? Like religion doesn't matter. We don't need religion. I don't have a religion. I don't care about other people's religion. Religion doesn't matter. It's completely inconsequential. But that isn't the atheist position. The atheist position is actually a positive philosophy, something we never get credit for, something we're always told we can't have. So when you and I and a lot of the people we talk to, the information that we get, even if it doesn't align, even if it doesn't present a coherent, singular view, it is a positive philosophy. When we come out and we say we want secularism, we're promoting something positive. We aren't taking this antithetical position. We aren't taking a nihilistic position. We aren't taking a null position where we don't need anything. Like we have a positive program that's just different from a religious positive program. There is this negative program, like this anti program, and that might be what we see in this non religious view, right? Doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah. I feel like in practice, I think it would be hard almost to live without some kind of like ethical kind of framework. I mean, even for people, I'm sure most people don't have, it's some elaborate ethical philosophy or something, but I think everyone has to some extent some principle like ethical principles that they live by. I mean, even though it may not be totally coherent, I don't think, I mean, it wouldn't be possible to just say, like, I believe nothing about like how to live and like how to interact with other people or something.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
they're not. It's not nothing. It's just this sort of stage of indifference. It reminds me a lot of this sort of like local cultural knowledge of the Revolutionary War in Massachusetts. Is it kind of treats it as like a third, and a third. Where there were some people who were Tories, like very very pro British. They had white chimneys. There were maybe a third that were very much American and revolutionary, and a third that just didn't care. Right? Like I'm not going to pick a side. It doesn't matter to me, right? Like you're the boss or he's the boss. Who gives a shit? There's no difference. It doesn't matter, right? Just leave me the hell alone. And so the part of the war, the cultural war at least, was to convince that other
mm,
third,
yeah, right, yeah.
right, that the other side is wrong. We're right, the other side's wrong. And that might be what this becomes, right? Where you have two opposing worldviews. How do you appeal to this middle position?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would definitely be interesting to know. I mean, even like they must have some opinions. I
Well,
mean, I
yeah,
guess it
yeah.
could be just sort of, well, it's interesting. I mean, like the whole like non-affiliated population. I mean, well, just like, there's always third of the population or whatever who doesn't vote in elections and things like this. But like, yeah, it'd be interesting to do more sort of research on. I guess maybe it could also be just sort of like these people feel like so like sort of disenfranchised. Yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of different things going
Well,
on
and I
too.
think that's what part of what the project is meant to suss out. Because we know there are those very very weird people in there who are irreligious but very religious. We know that there are those people who don't recognize any affiliation with the church because they're not hardcore Christian enough, and
Yeah,
only
right.
they
Yes.
have this personal connection to Jesus, so much better than any church, right? So we know that when you get into the nuns, this irreligious group, it's a strange stew. But this is what the project. This is why it's being investigated, and it's being investigated along these lines. And it looks like, I mean, just the insights, the potential insights are already very powerful. So, and or now, do you know, is this something they need participants for? Are they looking for people to survey and to interview and things like that, or are there
Um,
people they can get in touch with at the project?
I'm not even. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's so many different like within the bigger project. Like, there's a whole bunch of smaller projects.
Mm-mm.
So I think I'm not sure. I think people should go to the website and check out the different sort of stuff they're doing
Yeah, absolutely.
and
Even if it's
see.
for results, if it's for anything you're interested in, if it is law or the culture or death or health, whatever it is, it's plenty of interesting stuff. Check it out. If there's something that you can add to it, reach out, let them know. Are there other things that we need to plug, or anything else you want to add, Nathan?
I guess Lori was saying to me that, I mean, the project has still got like 4 years to go before it's like sort of complete. So, so there's definitely going to be more. I mean, we got, sort of the halfway point, I guess, to some extent in the project. So there's still going to be a whole bunch more stuff coming out. So I think it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, it's going to be it's so new, it's unexplored. Talk about death
Hmm.
cafes,
Yeah,
fascinating.
that's interesting. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
So yeah, people interested, reach out, check it out. If you have problems or complaints, don't take it out with Dr. Beaman. She's fantastic. Direct it
Yeah.
at me, Nath G. Alexander on the Twitters. It'll eventually get to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Anything else we need to plug?
We got to thank our Patreon supporters, Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus blog.
Fantastic.
Thank you guys.
Thank you very, very much for your support. And to all our
Yes.
listeners, thank you very much for your support. We appreciate anything you can give us. pitch us a dime on Patreon. Or if you can't do that, like and subscribe. That helps. Yeah, that's all I've got, Nathan.
So
Fantastic. Until next time.